All right, welcome everybody. Um, Welcome to Reuben Telushkin's Artist Talk for the IEA. We'll get going here in a minute. Just a reminder that this is being recorded. It's going to go up on YouTube. I'm Charlie Mannion. I'm one of your hosts. Cameo, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Cameo. I'm the other host. I'm an electronic integrated arts grad at Alfred University, and I'm happy to be here today.
Yeah, me too. We're very excited to be here. I'm in sculpture, but there's a lot of crossover here between Ruben's work and the stuff that Cameo and I are doing. So we're very excited to have the chance to talk about this. So just to introduce the IEA real quick, the Institute for Electronic Arts is dedicated to supporting contemporary artists through its primary focus on residency programs. These residencies provide artists with the opportunity to engage in vital research using electronic media, new technologies, and print media within fine arts disciplines while also benefiting local, regional, and global communities. In addition to residencies, the IEA supports evolving electronic studio research labs, hosts national and international conferences, and encourages projects in experimental media arts, print, and publications. IEA residencies and public engagement are thanks to the Shine Joseph Endowment, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the New York State Council for the Arts. Um, you can learn about the IEA via our website and social media platforms. The IEA is an amazing program that we're very excited to have here at the New York State College of Ceramics. Um, so Cameo, you want to introduce our artist?
Yeah, I'm introducing Reuben Telushkin. He's an interdisciplinary artist from Massachusetts. He graduated with a BA in studio art from Hampshire College in 2012, and has done so much more work. He was in Detroit in 2015, where he worked at Line Media Projects and was a resident at Talking Doll Studio, where he exhibited a solo exhibition in 2022. Recently, he was a Gilbert Fellow at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, where he earned an MFA in 4D design just last year. And he has exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, and so much more. So, thank you for being here today. Thank you for talking about your work, and we're looking forward to learning more about your process. Um, can take it away.
Cameo. Yeah, thank you, Cameo, uh, Charlie, Miles, everyone here at the IEA. I'm having a great time. Been here for about a week, and it's just been an amazing experience. And I'm grateful to still have some time left to keep touching all the toys that I haven't gotten to yet. I think we're gonna go for an hour and then um, wrap up with a Q&A until 4:30. Does that sound right? Uh, cool. Um, yeah, let's see where to start. Got this image on the screen here of this tesseract just kind of moving back and forth in and out of itself. And I always come back to this object that kind of like grounds my practice and kind of like my journey through my work. And it's going to be a recurrent thinking tool in this journey that we're on here. Uh, Before we get really into it, I wanted to give a shout out, well, more of a shout out, but an expression of solidarity with Mahmoud Khalil, who many have heard is a Columbia student, a Palestinian Columbia student who was detained and attempted to be deported by ICE today. And I I was thinking about that today, and freedom of movement is a really huge theme in my work, and it just kind of shows up constantly. And the ability to move freely is connected to our ability to think freely. And I just wanted to affirm that we all deserve to be able to have freedom of movement and to not have our movement confined. And just remember that no human being is illegal, but some laws are inhuman. I also, let me just say hello to everyone watching. Thanks for tuning in, present viewers and viewers in the future. Thanks for being here. Let's start with the ability to move. This is a book that I wrote for my graduate thesis, which I'm just going to kind of scroll through because it kind of contains the most recent and topical work. When talking about freedom of movement and degrees of freedom in the mathematical sense, like usually that refers to these 4 dimensions. And I've been reading some work by Catherine McKittrick. She's a Canadian scholar, focuses on Black studies and cultural geography. And she talks a lot about how the relationship between the Western categories of science and like knowledge finding are, they have an analogous correlation to the ways that Western powers inscribed like national borders on the landscape. So there's this relationship between how the body is moving in space on land and how our mind is moving through ideas, topics, subjects, different belief systems, ways of knowing. So for Catherine, for Dr. McKittrick, the act of like being interdisciplinary is the act of crossing a border. And so that's kind of the grounding of my thinking around transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary practice is almost as a rule. It feels important to synthesize and move fluidly between boundaries of creation and production because it affirmatively like breaks down these barriers that we have in our ways of thinking. And so these different dimensions are kind of analogous to the different creative modes of thought, starting with the dimension 0, which is kind of conceptual. It doesn't exist. It's just an idea. That's why they call it making a point. Get it? But not really. Like, if you think about the smallest thing you could possibly imagine, and then you think, what's even smaller than that? And so on and so forth. Like, it's kind of outside the rules of what we understand our physical material world to be. It can't exist, and yet here we are talking about it. So it's imaginary. So I think that 0, the conceptual, the introduction of 0 as a numeral, only about 1200 years ago into mathematics, kind of sets the stage for the virtual world. And there's lots of precedents in math and science of ages past that like foreshadow this technological era that we're currently in of the virtual and the non-material. So 0D is like the imaginary, the intangible, what we consider non-material, like virtual space. But as we'll see later, virtual space is quite material. And moving through 1, line of thought, linear, narrative, rhetoric, reason, just directional movement, which then expands into the plane, 2D, the image, the grid, and then vertically up into the solid world, 3rd dimension, the world of objects. And then 4D, which everyone's like, what is 4D? I have to answer that question all the time, and I love answering that question. The simplest answer is time. But still, what does that mean? You can see from this image here, it's the 3rd dimension, it's potential. We see the cube in motion. So 4D is like, it's where you're going and where you've been, it's your time echo. So it's kind of, if we can start to think about like potentiality and causality in front of and behind us as like these constantly rippling time echoes that do exist. Then we can think beyond the third dimension. And that's what I try to do as an artist. Okay, down here, you see this diagram of the box being dragged. It goes in, it creates this octagram shape, which I was obsessed with for too long, and I'm already talking about it for too long. You can see how obsessed with it I am. I just like felt the need to go into this octagon and all of the different patterns and shapes that it generates because I feel like it's a clue to a higher universe. So I was really into this shape for a while and did a lot of like sacred geometry drawing practices to kind of like uncover the mysteries of this grid that is kind of emerging to us from the natural world. I feel like it has clues to something beyond our third human dimension. And I started getting into trying to build it. So pulling from this shape language and trying to like construct these fractional dimension shapes like 3.5, 2.5, like in between flat, solid, in between solid and moving. Building what I call the cosmogram. Um, and the cosmogram is really just like um, this the mandala, the crossed circle or this like circular geometric story object that is like ubiquitous in nearly every culture in the world has some kind of like mandala program. And cosmogram specifically refers to the West African Congo version of the mandala, which is this it's this diagram that kind of describes the movement of life energy through four critical stages of birth, life, death, and rebirth. So it's this like guiding metaphor that I feel like it's a tesseract essentially. So you see these like traditions in African diasporic design and art and spirituality and thinking that really anticipate and precede these like fourth dimensional quantum approaches to life and reality. So I was building cosmograms and building like interdimensional objects. And by interdimensional, I mean that literally in the sense that like these are kind of flat works, but they're also relief. So they kind of like move back and forth between the second dimension and the third dimension. Um, and that's kind of like this four-dimension framework is a really practical analogy for how I think about interdisciplinarity. Like if I'm in the world of drawing and painting and printing and image making, like the 2D world has its own properties and rules and systems. And so interdimensionality is like a useful analogy for me in thinking about like how I'm combining different creative practices and modes of production. So I was making these like installations based off of kind of 2.5D works. So like kind of flat, kind of come off the wall a little bit. And you can also see that some of these are speakers. So I was making speakers, which is really terrible of me that I've only just mentioning that now because sound I feel like is 0D. And sound is kind of like so primary in my practice, sound and music. And it's a material. It's kind of like the creative discipline of sound, of 0D. You can't see it. I guess you can feel it. You can feel vibration, but that's kind of my point, is that sound, in order to understand it, you have to understand vibration. And to like work with sound as a material, you need to understand oscillatory wavelengths and energy signatures and vibration. So sound is in the category of 0D because it kind of has that border, maybe 0.5, because it's somewhat intangible, invisible, but it's still structures so many of the other arts. So I was making objects. I had gotten up to 3D. And I was documenting them in images, and I wanted to animate them. I wanted to make the images move. And I wanted to like kind of program them with behavior to be able to make them move in like interactive ways. So I started getting more into digital media here, trying to learn digital animation. I was reading this tutorial that made this offhand reference to CRT monitors. And at the time, I didn't know what a CRT monitor is. I'm sure many of the viewers do. You know, being an Alfred, you know, there's this whole history of analog video experimentation, and I'm hip to that, but I just didn't know that that's what those machines were called. And so once I started like Googling this acronym, because to me, CRT in the 2020 decades means something very different. The way that it's used in like rhetoric and discourse to mean critical race theory as kind of, you know, this boogeyman of everything that's wrong with America. They call it DEI now. They invent a new acronym every couple of years, every generation. But when I was in grad school, it was CRT. And so I was like, why is this animation tutorial talking about CRT? And it sent me on this research rabbit hole, which happens a lot. And I'm going to attribute that to freedom of movement, not just in our bodies, but also in our brains. And these spontaneous connections that just happen in our neurons. It's these wormholes, you know, across spaces that I think that generate so much of how I discover and move through my work and like to where I'm going. You know, these spontaneous connections lead me. So I was digging through the CRT and got into all this history about how the first transmission using CRT technology was for the 36 Olympics. And Hitler's speech of racial supremacy and ideology was the first radio signal powerful enough to leave space. And so it's kind of humanity's first like message to the stars is Hitler 36 at the Olympics, which I learned it just says so much about how our media communication technology apparatus is bound up in these like power struggles, and the push to develop these media communication technologies has always been ideologically driven. And so there's, you know, there's a reason why the ability to use these technologies was so important to certain people. CRT, critical race theory, cathode ray tube. Started taking it apart, got a CRT book, hollowed it out, put an audio amplifier in the book. Can you see that? Yeah, audio in the text, and wired the sound into the back of a CRT. I know I'm jumping all over the place here, but I want to explain how this works. You can kind of see that there's like 4 wires here, red, black, green, and yellow. And each of those wires represents an axis. 2 wires are for up and down, 2 wires are for left and right. And so when you feed an electrical signal into this magnetic coil, it draws light on an X and Y axis. So if you cut 2 of the wires and plug those into an audio source, it will draw the sound wave on the screen, which is what an oscilloscope is. And so I started doing that, started drawing on the screen with light, with sounds that I just chopped and mixed together, found material, different compositions. And the process of doing that, I put it inside a critical race theory text because, the acronym, I had to, use the text as material. But putting the text together with all of these electronics, I started seeing the color red, white, and black over and over again. Because going back to Casimir Malevich and the constructivists and supremativists, like the use of red, black, and white as colors to denote propaganda started, in those early 20th century Russian movements that were then copied by the Nazis for their own propaganda mechanisms that we later saw with CRT technology. And then also, like, for me as an American, or, kidnapped African in America, whatever you want to call it, looking at these colors and thinking about stolen people on stolen land and, moving these plugs around, red, white, and black, kind of like these 3 foundational subject positions of the United States. And so there's a book here, Frank Wilderson, he talks about it, red, white, and black, US cinema and the structure of US antagonisms, something like that. But red, white, and black, the settler, the savage, and the slave. Land plus labor equals power. Figuring out we'll move on from this soon. I was trying to figure out the structure of this sculpture. And so, like, running power from this black battery, which is the like labor source, that drives the whole operation at the bottom of the hierarchy, into this red book, which is like this spatial field that, the action takes place, and then output into the white monitor, which is this like, self, the protagonist. I was trying to think of different ways to present it, and to actually move the energy through this sculpture, because got 12 volts here. And so I settled on copper wire kind of taped alongside this wood sculpture to like be able to just clamp different things and have the signal go where I needed it to go. And the outcome of that was that I like just started thinking about circuitry as more like sculptural and like the actual design of like using elements from the earth to direct energy flows to make like repeated events occur as the definition of technology. um, made me want to use brass and copper as like just laid into wood as like sculptural forms that could like um, kind of make visible the flow of power, um, and kind of get us to look more critically at uh, electronics, and kind of demystify this black box and these abstractions that we're working with. Like I feel that technology and the digital and the virtual world are inevitably like they originate with the earth, but it's such an abstracted removal. It's so many like degrees of like refinement and synthesis into like plastic that we can't even plastic boxes that we don't know what's in there or how it works or where it comes from, but it's so far removed from the earth. And so by building these like wooden and brass circuits, I was trying to get back to the earth and thinking about electricity and electronics. So uh, this is a good place to watch a video, um, just of these. Ooh, y'all can see Touch Designer. Okay, let me show you. I'm a fake Touch Designer user. I just know what I need to know. Uh, but this is it's like some of these sculptures that I was making to like integrate wood and brass. Uh, let's start this over. Bear with me. All right, we're gonna pause on that for now. But to be transparent, like this video is on loop and I don't know how to start it from the beginning, which is the part that I need to show you. So we're just gonna go back to the still images in the second dimension. We're not ready for the fourth one of movement yet, but maybe it'll be there. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay. See that? So like wood, brass, resin, LEDs encased in resin, just brass touch points, boom, light on. And so I was like playing with the idea of wood joinery and like traditional like Japanese joinery and just the mathematics of like making reconciling contradictions and making two things fit together and how satisfying that like click is when you um interact with a designed object, the satisfaction of like something tangible, a tangible gesture like opening a doorknob or like clicking some buttons, hanging up a phone. Like there's this loss of the tangible and the relationship to the body and to the earth that I think is keeps getting pushed out of technology, but there's I think a medium to be had, besides just like disembodied glass screen virtual world and the stone wheel. Like we have options. Um, this piece is called Gatekeeper. So it's like it has these three brass switches that you would open one and it kind of like controls the flow of power from bottom to top. So it's this light that turns on depending on how many switches you have on, and you can have one, two, three, all of them on. But like like in electronics or signal processing, like a gate is a switch, and so just thinking about again the literal nature of power as we define it, not just as electricity, but in terms of access and hierarchy and these types of things. Um, those are more 2.5 dimensional panels. Yeah, so this body of work is called Power Structure. Um, and it's still very active. But I have kind of, as you can see, I've gone into textiles and fabrics, which is a whole story. How did that happen? Let's talk about it. Yeah, so I was really into wood joinery, trying to make these like, I don't know, an analog, electronic, interconnected objects fit together. Bring that down. I started using like the CNC to cut wood that I would find in Detroit, which is where I currently live, both from trees that would just fall in the neighborhood or from like buildings that were being remodeled or demolished. So like synthesis of the natural and the built environment, reused material, closed loop. So using a CNC, like a computerized milling machine on these like raw natural pieces of wood to build these like uh, analog electronic objects. First did that at Haystack in 2023. I was there for their open studio residency. That's Haystack on the right. And yeah, wow, what a view. That probably, I've always thought about landscape, but I think traveling to make art has pushed relationship to the landscape to the forefront in recent times. Like working with wood from different places, and then doing that in different places has started to push me to think about uh, freedom of movement, freedom of thought, how where we make affects what we make and what we learn through those processes. And then also using like virtual media to impact the physical environment in the form of designing cuts on a computer and then cutting a log with it. This kind of like very core act of what's in my brain, what's in this like non-tangible conceptual realm, then taking form. I feel like digital fabrication technologies like accelerate our ability to just kind of manifest our thoughts in the physical and built environment. So there's this feedback loop back and forth between this intangible dimension and our lived reality that is this kind of recurrent question. I did this tree stump carving project. It was kind of a one-off, but there it is. Yeah, so I mean, you can see here how I was getting a lot of my wood, milling it, pulling it from the neighborhood, and this is a lot that was cleared for maybe a house was demolished, maybe a developer's doing something. So just these questions of progress and value, material. I think the relationship of technology to process and this like inherent assumption that going forward is good. But I think direction matters more. Like what's forward, I guess, is my question. Just because you're moving, just because you're in motion doesn't mean you're progressing. And those questions are alive, whenever I see a tree come down or a house come down, like what is this moving towards? What's this for? So trying to make it all fit together. This is some of that process in my yard, summer in Detroit, cutting it on the CNC, making these electricity sculptures. Wood from Haystack cut down. This is some of that process. Trying to build these fields, these interdimensional fields. And yeah, just gaining facility with digital fabrication to get weird with making things fit together. I think that like I view the work of joinery as like another example of reconciling contradictions through material. Material is always like an analogy to our lived lives. And so making things fit, something that we're all always trying to do. Using the CNC to build these screens, these like moving screens. This is called boundary, this kind of like screen work. Again, you know, thinking about boundaries in the literal sense, and who's being kept out, who's being kept in, like what what passes through, what doesn't, what's filtered, and yeah, is it a wall or is it a bridge? You know, it depends on how some people look at it. I was lasering, using the laser cutter to like etch on the pieces before assembling it. So there's like little bits of itself intermixed and dispersed. The cut and the mix is kind of like a constant gesture for me. Cut and mix, cut and mix. These are drawings of music performances. So as I, you know, was building these objects, integrating digital techniques in designing and making them, and then documenting the work, the photographs and the images that I would take of the work became objects in and of themselves, and further material to work with. So it's kind of like the loop is completed from the digital design into the material world of building the object, and then back into the digital world as a new asset in the form of this 3D model or photograph. And so I kind of then started like just getting into this language of further blending dimensions. So that's kind of like what some of this stuff is. And, you know, there's me video editing in my studio. See if we can't go full screen on there. And just noticing these correlations between the editing process and the process of building a physical object. And being reminded that like digital work does involve the hand. Like my hand is on a mouse right now, and the amount of little clicks and thumb moves and, you know, wrist movements that it took to get the videos that I wanted. It was like, you know, having a X-Acto knife and paper to make a collage. And so I feel like there are all of these, which is how they used to do it for reel to reel. So there's all these like precedents, like these tangible precedents that create the language for the digital tool. There's always like been a material version that we call upon. Did a radio show, Cyber Blues, thinking about the African-American use of, and Black diasporic use of media technology, and the role of the impact of the Black diasporic use of media technology, the impact of that on modernism is just like, I needed a radio show about it. This whole, you see these like this beat matching system down here. Shout out to DJ Spooky, Rhythm Science. That's another important book for me and just way of thinking. Like the impact of a Black diasporic electronic music tradition, you can't understate just the way that it impacts all of how we use time-based media now. Like this play, pause, record, stop, forward, back, cut and mix, like material, like aesthetic language is so tied to Black creative production. And it's not just in music, but music is 0D vibration, so it comes first. So it's like it was similar for me, like in a way, like DJing, crate digging, beat making, like just a love of music and making music and being around the objects and the material culture that formulate like Black electronic music tradition and culture is how that was my entry point into creative electronics or new media or STEM or what have you. Like the encounter with audio and media technology is I think how so many visionary, not, let me not do that, but like all of the Afrofuturist icons, right, who have implications so far beyond music and entertainment, but just like modernism broadly. I think it just legitimizes music and sound as this like kind of like primary entry point for understanding all of the dimensions, which is why movement and motion and time, the fourth, the highest dimension that we can know of or think of, is so tied to just rhythm science. So that was Cyber Blues. And thinking about the languages of pattern making that have informed kind of our contemporary technology landscape and just like how we think about digital media as a medium is so informed by the aesthetic language of the DJ. So yeah, working with these timelines and starting to think about the timeline as like this artifact of digital culture, I wanted to bring it back across the dimension out of the intangible and into the physical. So I started thinking about like, because the loop is kind of this core gesture that is at the heart of everything that I just talked about. Looping is, computers don't work without it, code doesn't happen without it. Call and the response, the cosmogram, the circular movement through these stages that generates the back and forth across a boundary. These really simple recursive gestures that generate so much complexity and are pervasive in Black diasporic cultural production. They set the precedent for so much of material language of digital culture. But I'm repeating myself now. I wanted to make it physical again. And this was an idea that I had way back in 2019 when I was like busy doing something else, and I didn't have time to execute the project, so it kind of just like went on the back burner. And but it was a way of uh like I'm a digital hoarder, um, photos, texts, uh, objects, um, and I always want to like consolidate all of this, uh, this digital footprint that we accumulate into some kind of narrative, that doesn't just feel like a big whiz of files just scrolling by, and maybe translate that into something more, um, or less ephemeral. So I was building these turning machines, that started out as I started using paper. You can see here, and um, paper was really delicate. Uh, I I also had to learn motors for this, so I was like figuring out how do I make motors spin, and while trying to like have some apparatus scroll paper. And the paper was too delicate, so I moved to canvas, uh, which had this like more tensile strength. And then I that pushed me into somewhere I had never been, which is the world of textiles. And that's kind of like a domain of creative practice that has always been, on my radar, but like I think we like get into ideas about ourselves, like I'm this kind of artist and these are my tools and I this is my medium, and like what you do is tied to who you are, and that can restrict freedom of movement, that restriction of movement in yourself, like it predetermines who you get to be, and which goes back to McKittrick talking about these colonial boundaries of thought and land. So I fell into the world of textiles because I needed to make this scrolling image object. Um, and that so my first ones were janky. So I didn't know anything about, I never touched a sewing machine before, but I was like, I need to see this through. So I learned to sew, and this was the first piece I ever really did for it. And you can see here, there's kind of this like crossfade motif, um, which was like just me kind of like pulling on a really simple trope of animation of just something gradually changing over time, which I like assumed would generate a visual effect when I then scanned the object and put it back into the virtual world. So, constantly moving back and forth across the tangible and the virtual boundary. So I went with this motif of this like successive color fade, and uh, documented myself making the piece, used that for some of um, the piece, and then the crossfade is like, again, hip hop. Been talking about it. Um, these gestures of like how we think about moving back and forth, and reconciling contradictions are baked into the language of the Black electronic tradition. Dyeing fabric. This is a switch I made out of brass. And this is my thesis piece from last year. So this is like the first like public presentation of this kind of work. two spinning wheels, like a turntable. And that kind of catches us up to, well, not, it doesn't catch us up. That's how I arrived at the work that I am currently doing. So we'll switch over to Touch Designer, and I know we don't have much more time, but we'll just take you through some of these newer works. Yeah. So this piece is called Free the Land. And so it's this wooden frame that's got these scrolling cylinders and then a piece of fabric with a zipper so you can like load different ones on and off of it. So you load it on, you zip it together, and then it loops. Yeah, so coming from this language of DJing and digital culture and mixtapes and just like analog media and thinking about loops and clips and samples and breaks and the I can't believe it took me so long to get here because quilting is so, I mean, it makes sense that it has such a prominent place in African American like visual culture uh, because it's so like cut and mix. It's the original sampling. It's the act of like cut and mix, using different pieces from different sources, bringing them together. So that was already like a lot of how I thought about wood, and like just I think so much of my own way of working with material, whether it is digital material or found material, is the cut and the mix. And that's kind of like the gesture that I do across media and is an example of how like working with sound as a medium informs whatever material I'm working with. I'm going to crossfade it. I'm going to cut and mix it. I'm going to loop it. I'm going to put different loops next to each other together. I'm going to match loops, just like this language of time-based media. I think it ties to medias that we don't always consider time-based, but you take any object, any material, and you put a motor on it, it becomes time-based. Is what I found. So this is like one that I built after graduation, and you can see the step forward both in terms of the design of the frame and quilting ability. And then I've been on a couple residencies since I've made this. This I made at ACRE in Wisconsin. Been at a couple residencies where I've mostly just been sewing, as you can see behind me. With the idea being that like you don't need to buy a turntable every time you buy a record. Right. So that's kind of how I'm approaching this body of work right now is for every frame that gets built, like there is, so many countless clips or loops that can go on it. And so right now I'm just working on generating these reels. And I think that is let's see if I got another one here for you. I think we spend so much time in front of scrolling rectangle image boxes, and those are important spaces for us to tell our story and to like connect with each other. And I think that's what the original appeal of the internet was this like vast expanse of freedom of movement and connectivity and just like new ways to interact. I think there is something about that that keeps drawing us back, but I think the way that we've gotten off course from that is through like, I don't know, there's this loss of the tangible and this relationship to something where we can see how the gears actually work, and just have a relationship to the quote unquote real world. I don't like to say real, I say tangible or intangible, because everything's real. So just to like, when I, but kind of in that contradiction between like our physical embodied sensory experience, I think that's often what we mean by real. And so this current body of work is, you know, we've got the copper wire here, moving the power throughout the structure. So still thinking about the tangible flow of electricity that makes up circuitry and electronic media. And then also creating these narrative spaces for expression, and then recording and animating them to, I know we're at time, I'm sorry, I'll just kind of blast through these next ones. I started getting into image transfers and animating the frames for when it gets reanimated back into the digital space. So this is from a residency at Surf Point in Maine, where I was filming the coast and then doing image transfers onto fabric, and then scanning each frame and then reanimating it so it kind of becomes this like textile animation. And then like quilting in response to the landscape. And let's see what else we got. This one. Let's see that. This, you know, like as you can see, I was working a lot with abstraction, but like referential abstraction. So like kind of again like fractional dimension, like kind of representational. This one behind me was another landscape, kind of like lit out. So we're referencing like the way the digital culture is of the earth, but is like so far removed through abstraction and synthesis that it becomes something we can barely recognize and understand. And I guess I'm trying to reverse engineer back through abstraction to the earth, with these objects. And that's kind of what I've been doing since I've been here at Alfred. This is a recent piece that I made here, using the sublimation printer to get images that I've taken. So many pictures from road trips, and just different places that I've been, that, you know, we have this human impulse to document our movement, our travels, where we've been. And that's only going up in the era of media technology, that as long as there's been communication media, it's been to like tell a story about where you're at, where you've been, and how that relates to who you are. So since I've been here, I've been pulling from my digital archive of all of my photos and videos, and remembering that so much of your best thinking comes when you're like got a landscape whizzing past, whether you're on a bike or in a car, or a train or plane, like the vantage point that you get through being in motion stimulates consciousness in different ways of thinking. So that's that 4D higher consciousness of movement. It's not just time, it's motion really is the fourth D. There's no time doesn't pass unless something is moving and changing. If nothing is moving or changing, then time is imperceptible. So time is defined by movement, which is inherently spatial. So only time doesn't happen without change, going somewhere, becoming someone else. And so a lot of like what the images that I pull from now in integrating photography, even I was like doing these landscapes, and now that I'm integrating actual photos and representational stuff, it it's tied to this idea that movement and travel and achieving a different point of view has always been tied to like expanding consciousness and progress, however we want to define it.
This is so amazing.
No,
Thank you so much. Thank you for like it's so interesting how you uh intertwine both the video, like you relay it back into itself, so it kind of informs itself.
mm-hmm.
You're making like physical videos at the same time as like you've made the video and then it comes back into the physical and then it's back into this like uh transdisciplinary structure, which is really interesting. How you mix those in itself, even thinking of sound and movement as this 0D and moving it through was really interesting. Thank you so much. This
Thank
is
you.
great.
Sorry I went over a little bit.
No,
No,
you're great. If you wouldn't
no,
mind, I've actually got some questions. I'd love to ask you more about what you're working on, if you don't mind hanging out
yeah.
for a little bit.
Happy to talk about it.
So, I mean, I'm curious because I think you're sincerely engaged in political discourse in like a really deep way. And actually, one of my questions that I think you answered pretty thoroughly was how your material experimentation is intertwined with your like research into the history of sort of like where these gestures and mechanisms come from. And it seems pretty like this research really coincides. Like your research informs your experimentation, which prompts more research. Stop me if this doesn't feel right, but that makes a lot of sense to me, and the way that that opens up possibilities for you as a person to like think across boundaries, create motion and movement within your own practice and within your own thinking in a way that just seems like it's liberatory for you as a person. And I'm curious actually though, you know, you're also a political activist, like, and your work I think carries a lot of political implications. But I'm curious how you see the role of producing the kind of work that you're making, how that relates to, like, how does that work engage with politics in a direct way? What, like, how do you think about that? Do you make work with the intent that it will have some kind of political impact? I'm just curious how you think about that.
Yeah. I think like I I was raised to care about other people in the world. And I think that either you're a person who cares or you're not. And not to make everything absolute and black and white, but um, if and that just kind of like surfaces in the art because it's already how I'm like thinking about what matters. Like I think there's a tension between um, a good example is like the kind of the tension between abstraction and realism and like the utility of one versus the other in terms of like a social mission, and specifically within like African American art and tradition, there's historically been like a lot of pressure to do more like figurative, representational, like or text-based message-driven work, and with the inverse implication being that abstract work is less political. And I think that's kind of like the the questioning area that I like work within, is like at what point does creating beauty become non-political? Like if I'm just like, I just think this landscape is beautiful and I want to make it, like um is that like unremoved or disconnected from maybe like the more overtly like political work, like the red, white, and black CRT work, which talks a lot about how like the technology of propaganda that was developed by these regimes totally influences our whole contemporary understanding of visual culture, like just how we think about conveying a message on moving image. Like you can't talk about that without talking about fascism, because like the histories of the technology of the moving image and of the recorded image, and just like the our modern conception of like using media for storytelling is so interlinked with these ideologies that
Mhm.
like it just always comes up eventually. And so I think I kind of just like respond with a critical lens as I do when I'm walking down the street. And some pieces are more literal, like the title lets you know, like I'm thinking about power structures. Um, or and some are more organic and just a response to life. But I think the ratio is the same in terms of like how we live our lives, and what we critique and what we like oppose. The same, we're not doing it every second of our lives, but like hopefully we're being fairly consistent. And I think the same ratio comes up in my art making.
That makes sense. And I mean, I hope this isn't unproductive to say, but also your presentation made me think about the history of like the recuperation of radical Black images and gestures, just like even formal gestures, thinking about something like beat matching, DJ culture, quilting, just like any number of like aesthetic gestures that are within the repertoire of like pop, fascist, whatever kind of name it, imagery, that stuff has been sucked up and then deployed to often to oppressive ends. And so I couldn't help but think about that during your presentation. I'm like, this is really interesting, innovative work. And also it's situated within this history of those gestures being sucked up and turned around and redeployed. Um, I don't know. I'm just thinking about, and it has me thinking about that. I don't know what you do about that, but
It's a double-edged sword for sure. I mean, like everything that we're doing this talk on comes from kids in the Congo digging cobalt out of the mud, and like that doesn't mean that this technology doesn't exist. It just means that exploitation should not exist. Um,
Mm.
and if this technology can't exist without that exploitation, which I don't think is true, then it shouldn't. Um, but it's just the nature that it does, that I think is like, um, I won't say a gray area, but I just, the ubiquitous nature of living under capitalism, and being forced to participate in things that you don't agree with, um, is so
Yeah,
in the creative practice as well.
yeah, for sure. I think a lot. I'm kind of glad it's me and Charlie doing this interview because a lot of your practice relates both to our practices that like we spoke about in passing. And just like the overall thing I really like within your work is kind of the underline of your implicit, like everyone is implicit in this, movement in this reality. It's very apparent, it's very like in your face, but also it's very minimal at the same time. Um, a lot of my work thinks about the idea of how like these who allows us to see these images, who chooses what we see, who chooses what we hear.
Mhm.
And I think that is really interesting how you get to refer that back into the work using these different materials.
Thanks. Yeah, like I think that that connects to kind of the last question as well, because like it's not using these um like really kind of traditional materials and techniques as a form of like getting back to the earth or the body or like uh rehumanizing is not, it's romantic in this like uh look like I won't say backwards looking sense, but like or like nostalgic, like referencing the past, which is like so much of what romanticism was, but it's not calling for like us to abandon, like it's not a call to like these technologies have a use in our lives, and like I think yeah, it's not an all or nothing, like throw the baby out of the bath out with the bathwater. Like every generation has its like TV is corrupting the children, like
Right.
music is corrupting the children. Like
Well, and
Yeah,
alienated labor, right? Like it's part.
yeah.
that's a great like so the Luddites, where the term Luddite means colloquially, like we use it to mean someone who's just like anti-technology. But the actual Luddites were these British workers who like opposed the introduction of like automated technology into their industry because it was just going to force them to compete with machines,
Yeah.
um, under capitalism. And so like that's a ubiquitous conversation, and it's very alive in Detroit, the history of like automation and competing with machines for jobs. And it's never about the technology, because the technology is supposed to make life easier. It's supposed to move humanity
Hmm.
into the future, like make a like more interconnected, more aware. But under capitalism, we just are like made to still, it has this relationship to labor that like is not liberating. And so yeah, Cameo, just to like tie it to your point, it's that like that middle ground of trying to find just way, not to like get rid of the technology, but to like keep fighting for like just ways to move forward.
Hmm. Yeah. We spent a lot of time talking about like your practice and the history and its work. I wanted to know like how does the relationship between technology and your artistic practice, like how does that reflect in your daily life?
Mm. Um, I think building my own video machines is like a way of trying to divest from having to use someone else's. Um,
Yeah.
like I think there's a big cultural turn right now towards like digital autonomy, or like I think there is this sense that like they've got us locked in, right?
For
And
sure.
it just kind of goes back to this recurrent theme that we're not trying to go backwards, um, but like we want more humanizing ways to experience these paradigms. Like, you know, when someone is too online, what do you say to them? Go touch grass.
Yeah.
So it's like this nature online dichotomy that we view in
Mhm.
opposition, that like being online is taking us away from touching grass, and they can't coexist. But I try to make them coexist because I love touching grass and I love being online.
Yeah.
And
You're
but
touching wood at this point.
touching wood, you know, basically wood,
Wood,
you know, just the
wood
next.
and textile. Yeah.
Um, but in like, yeah, so in my daily life, I I don't know how to code. I don't like I didn't like
Yeah.
I learned how to do what I need to do. But I'm approaching it from, and that's like no shade to like actual engineers who are art and technology people, like they exist too. But I think I identify myself as like a DIYer, even though like I've taken like classes in undergrad, and you know, my master's degree is like increasingly more and more towards art and technology, but I still like advocate against the gatekeeping and the specialization of um, technological literacy. And I think like
Yeah.
the Black electronic tradition is what I call it. It points to that, like self-made engineers, tinkerers, people who just take stuff apart, um, get zapped, learn. Um,
I
but
mean, it's interesting because I feel like, you know, and we're at Alfred, which I think is particularly like craft oriented or like kind of material
Mhm.
culture oriented. And you know, to me, it's like really clear to see the liberatory potential on the production side, where like tinkering with things, you know, kind of working with your hands has this way of overcoming the like sort of contemporary technological alienation. But it
mhm.
seems
Right.
much more complicated on the computer side or on the consumer side to me, where it's
Yeah.
like I can try to avoid, uh, you know, whatever, like the fact that my car has a computer in it, the fact that I have a smartphone, I can try to avoid that all I
Yeah.
want. But, you know, to keep up to a certain extent, we kind of have to like roll with the sort of needs that have been newly
Yeah.
constructed. You know what I mean? And I guess just getting back to Camille's question about how you deal with this stuff in your everyday life, you know, I think that's to me, there's like a lot of unknowns in that part of the equation.
It just keeps coming back to the means of production and
Mm.
controls them. You know, there's people that have talked about that.
Well, we'll have to look whoever those people are up. But thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. I feel like I could just ask you questions forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, really appreciate you being here, Reuben. And if you are listening to this and you are interested in Reuben Telushkin's work, you can find more of it at rubentelushkin.com and at Reuben Telushkin, I assume, on Instagram. Um, my name's Charlie Mannion. You can find me at charliemannion.com, on Instagram at c.mannion. Cameo.
My name is Cameo Chambers. You can find me on cameochambers.com and Cameo Chambers on Instagram as well, with a K.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, this was
Thank
really
you.
great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Miles, for setting it up, and to the IEA for hosting this. And
Yeah.
thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Signing off.